Fellow Zena Brecht Rodriguez. And we want to welcome to the world Noah Gabriel Gottesdiener. Congratulations to our former producer, Laura Gottesdiener, on the birth of your son. I just call him Noah Gaby Baby. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Hermine Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamarie Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Mary Conlin. Our executive director is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, John Randolph, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. Tomorrow on Democracy Now!, we'll talk about British colonialism and Northern Ireland. The King is in Northern Ireland today. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for another edition of Democracy Now! Stay safe.
The viewpoints expressed in this program are the opinions of the people expressing them and are not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along today. And we titled this program internally, Colonialism and the Passing of Empire. I'm not sure we're going to get to that over the course of the hour, but we may. And if you're interested in weighing in on all things having to do with British royalty, we'd be glad to have your point of view. Our approach is going to be this. I've got a colleague, maybe a couple of colleagues joining me today who are in different parts of the world. And my question to them and to myself and to you is, what does the transition in Europe, the transition of the crown from the now deceased queen to the new king, mean to African people, to people who were colonized, who were the victims of imperialism, to people who in many ways had their historical memory erased, and in its place, in our mouths, placed the memory, the history of Europe, of white supremacy. So I'm interested in having that conversation with all due respect for the loss of life, the transitioning of any individual. We give that person respect. But we think this is an important time to look at the history, the legacy of the relationships around power in the world, and in particular, Europe's role, England's role in the atrocities, the crimes against humanity that resulted in the movement of millions of people across the Atlantic to North America, South America, and people subjugated in their own homelands throughout the continent of Africa, India, and elsewhere. So those are things that we want to capture in the course of this conversation. We invite you, if you're listening anywhere, to go online on KFAI, go online at YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter, find us there and join the conversation, weigh in. We'd love to have your voice. And if you want to come on camera or on mic, just send a note to the chat on the format that you're on, and we'll try to get you in personally. I want to begin, however, though, sort of taking up with the conversation that I've had. Also, right now I've got two people in studio with me. Kenneth Ebon is with an organization in Twin Cities that's focused on education. It's called Advancing Equity Coalition. I'm going to start with him in a couple of minutes, but also here is my friend and colleague, Maestre Yoji Sena, who joins me regularly from Bahia in Brazil. And Bahia, Brazil is facing an election in the next several days. I'm going to ask him to talk about that, but also to talk about the questions I raised earlier, the question of empire, the question of colonialism, the question of how we reclaim our memory, our voice, and our capacity to forge futures in which we emerge victorious and fully human and fully in alignment with what we believe is the will of creation and of the creator. So let me begin by welcoming Kenneth Ebon. Brother Kenneth, how you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Al.
Well, thank you for being here. You know, you published an essay in the Star Tribune. We're going to be running that in Inside News. If we haven't already, we will. We got permission. But it was about education and the challenges and some solutions. The organization, Advancing Equity Coalition, has a vision that every child in Minneapolis public schools should receive a high quality education. And you say that your mission is to develop the political will to eliminate institutional racism at Minneapolis public schools. So talk about that. What's that vision statement and that mission all about? Break it down for us.
Yeah, so with our vision, it was really important for us, our coalition members, because as you mentioned, Al, our coalition, we are a coalition of organizations that are focused on education justice in the city. And we really wanted to state clearly that it is our focus that all students in Minneapolis receive a high quality education. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, right now, all does not include students of color and Indigenous students when we're trying to figure out like who's going to get a high quality education. And so it's our goal right now to ensure that every student receives a high quality education, so that it does include Black, Brown, Indigenous students in this city. And so we see one of the major issues in this right now is that right now we don't have the political will of the city to actually change the policies and practices necessary to get us closer to a school system that can actually provide students of color and Indigenous students with the high quality education. We have a lot of folks that are really entrenched in the way that the system currently exists, but we know that the way that Minneapolis public schools currently exist is doing real detriment to our communities of color and our Indigenous communities in Minneapolis. And so, for a city that, recently went through an uprising because of the murder of George Floyd, we have to really ask some really difficult questions across to all sectors, and especially in education, with one of the greatest disparities in academic outcomes between white students and students of color, and also just the dismal outcomes that students of color and Indigenous students are experiencing in comparison to nobody in isolation, right? And so we are really looking at trying to address the policies and practices in place that allow this to take place.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest is Kenneth Ebon. He is the executive director of Advancing Equity Coalition. We're talking about equity in education. So, Kenneth, thank you for being here again. Thanks for the opening comment there, but let's unpack some of that. Contextualize the problem that you have formed yourself with allies and colleagues to address. What's the backstory?
Yeah, so for years, Minneapolis Public Schools has been failing communities of color and Indigenous communities when it comes to educating our children. In Minneapolis, white students actually receive a very high quality education. And when you're looking at the academic outcomes and experiences that they receive in terms of like their test scores, in terms of graduation rates, in terms of participation in advanced courses or rigorous courses. But Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, who are actually the majority of Minneapolis public schools, we do not see those outcomes take place for them, right? We know that, for example, the data just came out in the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment, the Minnesota Standardized Test, that less than 10% of Black, Brown, and Indigenous students who took that test are mastering math standards, right? Less than 20% of Black, Brown, and Indigenous students are mastering reading standards, right? And so like that is a huge issue in our community when we're saying, 1 in 10, 1 in 5 students of color are reading at grade level or doing math at grade level. Like, that is a real issue.
So how did that happen, Kenneth? What has it always been so? And if it hasn't, how did it happen?
That's a great question. And, you asked me to contextualize it and be a little bit more present, but I have to bring it back to a little bit of history. We know that our education system was never actually built for students of color and indigenous students in this country, right? That our education system was always built for wealthy white male students, and it's been trying to play catch up as our public system has needed more, or is needed to serve more, as our communities have demanded that they serve more students, and as our communities have sued for the right to have integrated schools, to be included over and over again. We've seen the fight take place. And so as that has happened, we've seen, again, these specific communities of color, indigenous communities, just not be adequately served because they've just fought for the right to be present, fought for access, for the basic necessity of access to even be able to walk into those institutions. And so the institutions have never actually fully accepted our communities. And this is an issue that is definitely prevalent across the country. But in Minneapolis public schools, we know that we have the greatest disparities when it comes to our education outcomes and experiences. And so this starts with really at the beginning of the history of public education in this country. But we have to find solutions now because our population in the city is changing. Our population across the country is changing. And we need every single student, every single young person to solve the challenges of tomorrow, because, we're looking at climate change, we're looking at homelessness, we're looking at, job security, healthcare, right? Like, all of these issues are coming to a head, and we need our young people to solve these issues.
And so when we talk about the process, the system having not been created to serve the interests of Black and brown people, then to what end both was it created, and to what end has its policy and practice been in its interface with Black and brown people and our communities? So what would you say has been the real, not the de jure posture of public education, but the de facto posture of publication relative to the lived experiences and aspirations of Black people, brown people, people of color? What do you think?
Yeah, so, I think that our public education system was meant to do two things, right? It was, one, meant to be a place for white, wealthy families to send their child to get, this high level education to, feed into all the Ivy Leagues, all the universities that we had created from, our quote unquote country's founders. And like, that was the initial idea. And then, like I said before, over the course of several decades, and over the last century, right, we know that our different communities have sued for the right to have access to public education. Now what we're looking at is, what are the systems that are in place that prevent our communities from properly being served by our public education system? Are several things, right? Like, I'd say one of the biggest issues is the resource hoarding. We know that resources flow towards white communities more so than they flow towards communities of color and indigenous communities, even though that our communities of color and indigenous communities are the ones that are attracting the resources, especially to Minneapolis public schools. They're the ones who attract the resources to Minneapolis public schools, but white students are the ones that most greatly benefit from those resources being attracted to Minneapolis public schools. So that's a huge issue. We have a ton of policies in place that do not see our communities and see the history of our communities, that don't see the challenges that our communities have gone through, the racism that our communities have gone through. They don't see that. They just see everyone as the same. And there is no there's no equity in place, right? There is no meeting the needs with those policies. And so what ends up happening is we try to create a policy that's one size fits all, that doesn't take into consideration the different populations and the like historical context of what communities have been experiencing. And then somehow these policies just end up benefiting white people, right? And so white communities, white students, white schools. And so I think that has been a huge challenge. We know that our teaching force in Minneapolis public schools does not match our student population in Minneapolis public schools. That's another big issue. And that was the main issue that I wrote about as you introduced me, and we talked about a little bit in terms of, how do we make sure that we recruit and retain teachers of color in Minneapolis public schools? So those are, three of the issues. There are many, many more that I can go into. Just the general respect and understanding and valuing of Black, Indigenous, Brown communities in Minneapolis public schools. There's a lot there, but yeah, I hope that helps create a little bit of.
We're having a conversation, and this is good.
Yeah.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest is Kenneth Ebon. He's the executive director of the Advancing Equity Coalition. And we came to this conversation because I got a press release from his organization asking us to look at an op-ed piece that he had submitted to the Star Tribune. We asked permission to use the same op-ed piece to share those ideas, his ideas, with our audiences at Inside News. And in fact, I asked him today if he'd be willing to read the essay, because to hear it in his voice gives you even greater insight into the thinking, the passion. So Brother Kenneth, if you have that piece pulled up, would you go ahead and read that?
Yeah, I want to just create a little bit of context before
Sure.
we get into it. So this spring, as most people in Minneapolis know, there was a teacher strike in Minneapolis. The teachers went on strike. Also the education support professionals went on strike for higher wages, and then for several other work condition issues, smaller class sizes, different things like that. As a part of that, our organization, several teachers of color, both Minneapolis Public Schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, all also wanted to figure out a way to ensure that we were able to grow our diversity in our teaching population in Minneapolis Public Schools as opposed to undercutting it. So they included an article to ensure that we do not cut any of our underrepresented teachers through a process of budget cuts or anything like that. Those teachers can still be released for any performance issues, for any behavioral issues as they go through that process with their union. But due to budget cuts, we wanted to make sure we do not lose any more underrepresented teachers in Minneapolis, because Minneapolis Public Schools has created a huge investment in recruiting and retaining those teachers, just to then be cut when budget cuts happen because they're the least senior. So
that addresses the common known process of first in, last hired, first fired, right?
Yes, exactly.
How do you stop that hemorrhage?
Yeah, and so both sides came to an agreement after a lot of conversation, a lot of community input and pressure, came to an agreement to ensure that underrepresented teachers would be protected. And so recently in August, there was a right-wing push by their media and then by politicians to have that that contract provision come under a lot of scrutiny. And so then finally that led to a lawsuit that was recently filed against Minneapolis Public Schools to prevent their taxpayers from paying for this, what they are calling a racist policy against white people. And so that was what I wrote my op-ed about. And so, yeah, I'm happy to read it for you.
Sure, go ahead, please.
So this Monday, a lawsuit was filed against Minneapolis Public Schools for the recent agreement with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers to prevent teachers of color and Indigenous teachers from being released from the building or the district due to budget cuts. These protections for teachers of color are important because teachers of color and Indigenous teachers positively impact all students, students of color, Indigenous students, and white students alike. In Minneapolis Public Schools, 63% are students of color, but teachers of color and Indigenous teachers make up only 18% of licensed teachers. These protections are needed because a diverse teaching staff improves outcomes for all students, MPS has one of the worst achievement gaps in the nation, and teachers of color help students stay and help students learn. While MPS has increased the hiring of teachers of color significantly in the past few years, they are the first to be cut because of lack of tenure when budget cuts happen, and students repeatedly ask for teachers who look like them and understand their cultural background. Protections for teachers of color and Indigenous teachers from budget cuts is about preserving a diverse teaching workforce that represents the population of students. Both district and union leadership agreed that this was a priority and the best way forward. The protections put in place are not a point of controversy in Minneapolis. These protections are in place to prevent teachers from underrepresented groups from being forced to leave their building or the district because of budget cuts. These protections do not preclude any teacher from being released because of performance or conduct. The Advancing Equity Coalition, a multicultural, multiracial group focused on education justice in Minneapolis, led an advocacy effort in support of these protections because we know the district cannot afford to lose any diversity amongst its current teachers. These protections are critical because of the financial challenges the district currently faces. Last fall, the district projected the need to lay off more than 130 teachers to balance the budget, but was able to avoid that with the use of federal aid dollars that came to Minneapolis as a response to COVID-19. However, this federal aid will soon run out, and the least senior teachers, who are disproportionately teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, will be cut. Not to mention the 50 teachers of color and Indigenous teachers who were released from their building last year because of budget constraints. This manufactured outrage over the protections in the lawsuit is the right wing's attempt to distract and agitate their base as they continue to undermine our democracy and strip away our rights. If conservatives are truly concerned about this, they can simply agree to adequately fund public education with Minnesota's $9 billion surplus. So MPS does not need to worry about layoffs because of budget cuts. We will not allow this attack on teachers of color and policies that support them go unanswered. Our students demand and deserve the best, and the Advancing Equity Coalition will continue to fight to ensure each child in Minneapolis public schools, especially students of color and Indigenous students, are equipped with the teachers who represent them, their culture, their language, their identity, and provide the best outcomes for our students.
Powerful statement. And thank you for presenting that. Any feedback so far?
You know, we've gotten some feedback, mostly positive. I think people understand. And like I said in the op-ed and the piece, this is not a point of controversy in Minneapolis, right? Like most Minneapolis are happy with this. Both sides on the negotiating table agreed to this. They both said it was a priority. And so mostly positive feedback. You know, some of the negative feedback has been, you know, and what we've been hearing mainly from the right wing is we should be making decisions based on.
But where does the right wing show up in education? I'm trying to figure out, is there an organized right wing within MFT or within Education Minnesota, or are there parents who represent what I call Neanderthal ideas of white privilege that are voicing opposition to this idea of protecting because of knowledge, you know, the presence of BIPOC staff people inside the district? Who is the opposition? Where are they?
Yeah, and so that's the $1 million question. Where are they, right? Like no one can actually find who this taxpayer is that submitted this lawsuit. And again, this is just a Minneapolis resident who happens to be who also is a taxpayer. Mm-hmm. Right. This is not a parent who's upset about this. Mm-hmm. This is not a current MPS parent. This is not a current MPS teacher who was harmed by the provision, because the provision actually doesn't go into place until next year. So that's the $1 million question, is who is this right wing that is making this, that is so concerned about this issue?
What's his name? You know his name?
No, I don't know his name. What I do know is that, you know, Alpha News was the one who originally picked up the story. 5 months after this agreement was settled. The summer had started, the summer was ending, nothing had been said. Alpha News, who is a right-wing news outlet, decided to write this story. And then all of a sudden, the next day, you see a story on the national Fox News outlet. Then you see Matt Burke, who's the candidate running for lieutenant governor for the Republicans here in Minneapolis, starting to tweet about it, starting to tell stories about it. The Republican attorney general candidate starting to tell stories about it. Donald Trump Jr. tweeting about it, right?
Oh,
Right? And so all of a sudden you just saw this manufactured outrage from people who do not live in Minneapolis, who do not know anything about who know very little, if anything, about education. Like all of a sudden wanted to say,
they probably know a lot about education, and that's why they're doing what they're doing.
I'd have to disagree, because
they have an intent to continue suppression of our people.
I would
Their
disagree.
agenda is a power and supremacist agenda, and their goal then is to figure out ways to disembowel anything that reeks of progressive and inclusion. That's what I think.
Yeah,
I don't want to underestimate them and say they're dummies, because they're not dummies.
Yeah, I don't think
they're dangerous.
Yeah, they're dangerous. I agree with you. They are dangerous. I do think they do not. The people who at least were speaking out do not specialize in education policy and especially understand the dynamics of Minneapolis, right? Like, this was a hard fought conversation. This was a hard fought fight to get this through the finish line, even in progressive Minneapolis, even with both sides of the negotiating table saying this was a priority. This was really hard to get through, but it happened, right? And people were happy with where it landed. And then you suddenly saw all people trying to politicize it, people trying to make it a thing about racism against white people. And like I said in the piece, the timing is perfect for them, right? It was right after the January 6th committee had finished. It was right around the time that news was coming out about Trump's, hiding of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago.
Sure.
It's right after they're starting to see a big backlash after Roe v. Wade being struck down. It was right before, it's months before the primary or the midterm elections, right? Like, the timing was perfect for them to, pick on Minneapolis one more time after everything we went through as a city a few years ago. So I think what they wanted to do was try to say how backwards Minneapolis is, how dangerous this progressive thinking is. So I agree that I think they are very smart and thoughtful strategists when it comes to stripping away people's rights and trying to convince everyone that it's for the better instead of it's for the worse. I just don't agree that I think they understand education policy in Minneapolis, because I've seen them talk about this issue and other issues in education, and they're not doing a great job of it. They're not, the recent polls for the governor's race came out. Jensen and Burke are not doing well in talking to Minnesotans about education. So
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm talking with Kenneth Ebon. He's the executive director of Advancing Equity Coalition. We're talking about education. Kenneth, what's your background? What brings you to this position and to this point of passion for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I went to private schools growing up in the suburbs. I had an excellent education, and I really.
Where'd you go to school? Where'd you go to school?
So I went to Totino Grace High School in Fridley, Minnesota, and then an even smaller Catholic school in Columbia Heights, Minnesota, called Immaculate Conception. And so I went to those two schools growing up. I got a really great education. My parents were both immigrants, They didn't know a whole lot about the education system when they came here, but what they were hearing about public education, they decided to put me in private school. And so I went through private school growing up, went to the University of Minnesota.
Where are your parents from?
So my mom's from India and my dad's from Nigeria.
Okay.
Yeah. And so.
And what part of Nigeria is your dad from? Is he from Hausa land, Igbo land, or Yoruba land, or
he's from Lagos? So
from Lagos, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I went to the University of Minnesota, and had the opportunity to really reflect on my own educational experience growing up, and realized how fortunate I was for having such a great education, and then also realized how much my parents sacrificed in order to give me that great education, right? And so it was in that time and in that moment where I, started to get a little bit more involved in learning about like the education outcomes for students in public education, specifically in Minneapolis public schools. And that was about 10 years ago. And so over the last 10 years, I've dedicated my career and my life to trying to understand these education inequities that are in place. I graduated with a degree in political science. And, I enjoyed the opportunity to learn from, really intelligent folks, both here in Minneapolis, but also across the country about, the different things that were happening in our education system and what can
like who are your influences?
Who are my local influences? So I went to a lot of school board
Yeah.
meetings locally. So a lot of different local school board members helped me understand and learn. Some folks like Bill English, Linnell Mickelson, Chris Stewart, right? Those are definitely folks that were formative in my understanding. Tracine Asbury, the late Hussein Samatar, I had an opportunity to spend some time with. So those were some really important folks to help me learn here locally. And then I just had, as I was doing a lot of this in college. And so I had other college students who were doing some of the same work across the country, who were sharing what they were learning in their cities, whether it was LA, Denver, Durham, Raleigh, Boston, Columbus, right? And so I had a really awesome opportunity. But again, coming back to the reason why I stay in this work is because I want to make sure no family ever has to make the same sacrifices that my family made in order for their child to get a great education. I think our public education system is vital. It is crucial to the existence of our society, of our democracy, of our city. And like I said before, the future of like how we're going to answer some of these like very pressing questions that we have to have answered in addressing these issues. And so I do this work remembering that my parents made so many sacrifices that came at a real hardship to them and myself growing up. But now I'm thankful for. But I know that a lot of families don't have the same privilege that my family had in order to make those sacrifices, and that no family should have to, because we should have public schools that work for students that look like me, that look like my family. But unfortunately we don't. And but I think there is hope, and I think we can do better. We just have to be willing to ask and have the hard conversations and ask the hard questions and challenge some assumptions that have been unchallenged for a long time.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm talking with Kenneth Ebon, who's the Executive Director of Advancing Equity Coalition in Minneapolis. Kenneth, I hope you can hang out with me the whole hour, because I want to introduce you to my friend Yogi Sinha, Maestre Yogi Sinha. And the hip thing, the cool thing is that I have immersed myself in understanding and knowing my own Africanness. And it's not a new thing for me. For years, when one of my former employees went to, I think, Ghana or Nigeria, and then came back after maybe a study abroad for, some period of time, and she addressed me, she said, "Hello, African." And I was shocked. And this is back in the day when to be African was a negative, right? Where we were ambivalent about our race and culture and color. And so I said, "What did you call me?" Almost in a defensive posture. She said, "Hello, African." And I thought about it, and I listened, and I heard it, and I felt it. And it was as if she was speaking in a way that was physical, that washed over me in a way that made me say to her, "Please say that again. Say it again, and say it again." And so in a sense, it was a moment of transformation for me to hear and to see and to begin to think about myself differently. Sometime after that, I was in Jamaica at a conference of journalists of North America and the Caribbean. I'm a Caribbean person. My father is Cuban born, but Jamaican. His parents went from Jamaica to Cuba. He and sisters and brothers were all born there, came back to Cuba, then to this country. I claim Cuba, I claim Jamaica as part of my lineage. But in Jamaica at a conference, Professor Rex Nettleford described us for the first time of my hearing it as Africans in the New World. New World African. So that's what I call myself now. I'm a New World African. I'm an African in the New World. And then finally, I'll say this, that the connection I have through my own DNA research places me through my mother's line as a Yoruba. And the DNA results indicate my family are through that line, 99+% Yoruba of Nigeria today. And I'm connecting hopefully with the Lagosians who are blood relative. We've got a guy that I haven't met yet, but I'm aware of or communicating, who shares my 4th great grandfather and his 5th great grandfather are the same person, not grandfather, grandparent. We don't know if it's a man or woman, but we've got that connection. So to me, I'm on the edge of discovery, of reconnecting to my own specific familial lineage in Nigeria and as a Yoruba person. Yoji Senna is in Bahia, and he connected me with the Brazilians in Lagos. And they've got a community there that's rich, vibrant, and growing, and that is attempting to document and build out and build on this history of the number of formerly enslaved Africans in Brazil who found their way back to Lagos and built a vibrant community whose architecture, whose learning, whose training, whose dance reflected how they operated and fought for freedom in Brazil and in South America. So we've been having that conversation. Yoji, if you're there, and he may have stepped away, but that's a conversation that he and I are going to have, and particularly about the question of the elections coming up in the next few. But before he comes on, let me ask you this. I'm asking everybody this. This is not about your topic directly, but Kenneth, everything is connected to everything, right? And so the world is talking about the transition in the crown from Elizabeth II to Charles III, the new King of England. As I'm saying this to you, you are doubly impacted by it, by having triply impacted by a Nigerian father, British colony, an Indian mother, British colony, and we're here, you and I, descendants of colonial experiences. So what are your thoughts? And how do we begin to teach ourselves about antiquity, history, culture, and colonial empire, and how we both have survived it, and what must we do to break free, to decolonize our minds, to create a future in which we are the winners? What do you think, Kenneth?
Yeah,
that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's definitely a big question. And I do think our schools play a role in that, honestly. Minneapolis Public Schools recently created an ethnic studies graduation requirement. So every student has to take an ethnic studies course in high school before they graduate, which is, a big step, because before, right, we're just all learning about the Revolutionary War. We're talking about Africa as this poor, sullen place. The Middle East just has conflict, right? Like there wasn't, our forefathers were great, right? And now today we're talking about Patrick Henry is going to change their name finally, right?
Yeah.
We're finally starting to settle.
For those who are listening that don't know what you're talking about, take a second and talk about Patrick Henry name change. What does that mean? What is that?
Yeah, so Patrick Henry High School over in North Minneapolis, the board recently said that Patrick Henry can change their name and will provide resources in the process of changing their name to something else. This has been, a thing that's taken place now three times prior in Minneapolis recently, where the old Ramsey Middle School down in South Minneapolis is now Justice Page Middle School. We know that Jefferson.
Who was Ramsey? Who was Ramsey?
Right. So Ramsey was he was a general who was like very vicious to the indigenous people here in Minnesota. But we have Ramsey County that's still named after him, right? Like, so he's a highly commemorated person in our history, but we've always ignored like what all these folks were doing to, again, indigenous folks, people of color, across the country, right? And so, and in Minnesota, right? And so Thomas Jefferson Middle School is now Ella Baker Middle School, or K-8 elementary school. And so Sheridan was also changed to Las Estrellas, right? And so we're seeing this happen. And so Patrick Henry, who was, I believe he was a slave owner, is now, they're going to remove that name from that school, and it's going to be a new name. I don't know what that name is. They're going through that process. But this was a thing that, especially Black students, that school has a high population of Black and Hmong students. They've been fighting for. They've been saying we need to change the name of this school for a long time, of this slave owner's name on this building. You know, I identify by going to Patrick Henry High School. I'm a Patrick Henry patriot, right? They're like, no, we don't want to identify like that anymore. And so finally, after several years of advocacy, led by the students there, they finally have gotten to the point to changing the name. So I bring all of that up to say, right, like, you know, we have accepted a lot of things as a society, right? We have accepted that, you know, the British colony, the British imperialism was just a thing, and it's okay that all of us speak, you know, so many countries speak English, but right, like, what colonization actually was violent, was genocide, was the stripping away of cultures and practices that was, you know, that was terrible for communities, right? Like, we still see the impacts all over the world. And, you know, we're talking about British imperialism because of the Queen's death, but like, let's also talk about the US imperialism as well. Right.
Spanish, Portuguese,
right. Everywhere.
The Netherlands. Yeah,
exactly. Right. And so, you know, and we've seen like resources extracted from places. We've seen culture extracted, you know, and, you know, just to make a few folks wealthy. And right, I don't think, and so I say this, all of this to say, like, our schools play a role in helping peel back all of these layers of history, right? And not just telling a white dominated perspective of history as like, you know, the settlers came over to the US and they were so kind and gentle, and we have the story of Thanksgiving, as opposed to like, no, we brought disease, we didn't know what we were doing, and then we waged war.
We murdered the continent.
Yeah, we murdered the people, the continent.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that is also what British imperialism was, right? And so, and I mean, it was a form of British imperialism to begin with, actually. And so, yeah, so that's where I think, you know, our schools play a big role in peeling back.
So what can schools do to encourage critical thinking, an examination of truth, which should have been, and which has been espoused as the mission and the work of higher education, of education, period. But if you step back, you could say the mission has been indoctrination and training of young bodies and young minds to not question, but to support, to find how they fit in a system that disadvantages the many for the advantage of the few, the wealthy, the powerful, and that governments and institutions have colluded to perfect that process of extraction. And you mentioned it, the extraction of minerals, the extraction of human capital, the extraction of people's souls and spirits, their identities, their culture, for the benefit of the few. I was reading something a couple of days ago, or listening to someone who said, in providing analysis, I think this was probably maybe Dr. Greg Carr, if not him, somebody else that I listened to a lot. And he was saying that part of the work of capitalism and colonialism, imperialism, is to decapitate. They mentioned that in some of the wars between African kingdoms and British invaders, the British demanded and got the severed head of a sovereign, of a king, which they shipped to London to sit alongside the severed head of the king of the Maori from New Zealand, right? So part of the practice and part of the demonstration of both their ruthlessness and their willingness to be and do what I call evil was that they celebrated that themselves by taking as a spoil and as a symbol a human being's head and setting it on display on the royal grounds at the seat of government of power in London. And so the metaphor there is not only did they take that physical head, but they've also taken the figurative head, meaning taken our memory away and replaced our memory with theirs. So the memory we have that we operate from is a memory that can recite all the glory of Europe and the power of white people. It's a memory that discredits, disavows, and dismisses Blackness, nativeness, indigenousness anywhere in lieu of or in deference to the lie of white brilliance and of white power. And so if that is the case, then what is the role of education and what is the logical outcome of the challenge when students, families, parents, communities, cultures say, you know, we recognize our own resilience and we recover our memory, and our memory is able to repel and resist and reject the memories that have been given to us as history, and we tell a new story. What's the outcome? Where do we go?
Yeah, and I think if you talk to any educators and you spend like 10 minutes with them, honestly, you start to hear pretty quickly, right? Like that we need to change the way that we host a classroom, right? It can't just be the teacher in the front of the classroom that talks and talks and talks and like shares and shares and shares. What we really need to see is a teacher, an educator, being a facilitator of learning, right? And a facilitator of exploration. And I think that's where we have to go, honestly, is when we're in math class, when we're in science class, when we're in history class, when we're in English class, right? Like figuring out like how can we allow students to really explore their own identity, their own history, and then explore the things that they're interested beyond that as well. And then how do you have an educator who is just facilitating that learning, that helps, that guides, but isn't the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong, but is like, how are you helping you figure out how you're critically thinking about these questions? And so, I think that's really where the direction of public education and our whole education system, not just public, private, whatever, has to really go down. And I think that it's important in order for us to really understand this imperialism. I'd say, how we got here and, the indoctrination that takes place is, a lack of representation for, having in Minneapolis, again, progressive Minneapolis, we're one of the more diverse cities in the state. We have 80% of our teachers are white. 80%, right? And so we still aren't having that representation. So what does that mean in terms of why isn't a student able to like being so disconnected still from their own history, right? Well, you have somebody who was also taught that, white imperialism was great. The ways of white culture is actually just culture. It's not white culture. It's just culture. And so that's what they're reinforcing in the classroom. That's what they're reinforcing in their behavior standards. That's what they're reinforcing in like what a student explores and how they express themselves. And we have some white teachers who understand that dynamic and are pushing back against it 100%. But that's the importance of having a person of color in the classroom or an indigenous person in the classroom, is to say, like, this is the narrative that you are told in media, society, the books, whatever. But like, let me tell you how to critically think through that, because like, I know there is a different story, right? So if you're a white teacher that doesn't necessarily know that there's a different story to be had or to be shared or to be perspective to be talking about, yeah, you're just going to plow along sharing that, reinforcing all of those messages that we receive, as opposed to being like, you know what, I've had to explore this myself. I know this story. Now let me help you figure out how you can understand a different perspective of this story. So instead of like, oh, British royalty, our forefathers, whatever, let me talk to you about like the people who were here before our quote unquote forefounders were here, right? Because how can they be founders if the land wasn't lost, if the land had already been discovered, if the land had already been inhabited, right? And so I think that's the importance of that. And then you go to the next layer of outside of the classroom. You go to your principals, your administrators, your school board members. If they've been reinforcing all of that as well, your state legislators, your governor, your president, right? Like, then you have a really, really, you have that indoctrination happen really quickly. And again, going back to this mysterious right wing, you see the conservative push, the conservative messaging across the state, across the country around like, we have to get rid of critical race theory. No one's even talking about critical race theory in K-12 education. Critical race theory is a theory that is taught in law school. All we're talking about in K-12 education is like, let's explore other people's identities. Let's explore other people's histories. But they have, again, galvanized and are trying to agitate their base around this idea that we're trying to steal their history by having a conversation about other people's history and saying that that's wrong, and then clumping it in as critical race theory, and then saying like that's dangerous for everybody involved because they see it as a threat to, like you said, the decapitation that they have created already, right? And so I think that's an important aspect around the role of education and the politics of what is taught in the classroom and how that's playing out right now in front of us every single day.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. And I'm talking with Kenneth Ebon. He's the Executive Director of Advancing Equity Coalition. I had hoped that Brother Yogi Sana, he's in the back room, but maybe he had to step away. He's in Bahia. And I wanted him to be in this conversation. We talk about this all the time, about the question of culture, the question of language. And with his help, Kenneth, Insight News has begun a recitation or what's the right word for it? We've relaunched our multilingual page section called Afrodescendientes. And we have a series of articles, the first series authored by a Venezuelan diplomat who used to live here and who was assigned to different posts in Mali, Nigeria, other places in Africa, who's a friend, a cultural icon and leader. And he's writing about the Afro-Descendiente experience in Colombia and in Venezuela and throughout the diaspora. Through Yogi's support and involvement, we began to translate his articles and present them every week in English, originally to us in Spanish, then to English, then to Portuguese, and now we've also added Swahili, we've added Yoruba, and we've added Somali, since there's such a huge Somali population, and we added French. And the idea is that between these languages, we cover much of the spoken modalities, speech modalities that our people experience. We know that there might not be a gazillion people in Twin Cities that speak all those languages, but that's the beauty of the digital technology. The city limits no longer are boundaries for our imagination and for our ability to know each other and to collaborate. So our hope, Kenneth, is that we're creating a series of conversations in the newspaper and online digitally that we can share with our people who speak in these idioms, these languages, in the Yoruba community, in the Somali, Swahili, Spanish, English, and French communities as well. And I want to thank Yoji for helping me develop the ability and the capacity and the will to do this. So I'm not sure why he's not able to connect with us, but let's you and I keep talking till we're done.
Yeah.
And so how important is it, I'm asking you as an educator, that we expect that our children can develop and exercise the capacity to navigate many languages, many ways of knowing and doing? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the world is becoming increasingly smaller, I guess, in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're all more interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that us being able to communicate in different ways with different people, understand different ideas, I think are all really important aspects around how we're going to, again, solve some of the biggest issues that are facing our community, our society, our world. Being more in touch with our indigenous roots and like connecting with indigenous practices and cultures and understanding like what it means to actually
let me jump in here, because I see we have Yoji sent it back. Yoji, I was looking for you the entire hour, but we didn't have you connected. Come on for the last 5 minutes or so, Yoji, and I'm sure hopefully you were able to hear Brother Kenneth Ebon. Great conversation. Yoji, what's happening in Brazil right now? What are you thinking about along these lines and along the lines of the election coming up? I only have about 5 minutes, so I want to give that time to you.
Okay. Well, here we are in the expectative of the elections. We are 20 days away from the election. And now there seems to be a chance that Lula can be elected in the first term, right? Because if a candidate doesn't reach 50% of the vote, the election goes to a second term. So there's a great chance of Lula be elected on the first term. The environment, it is charged.
Describe the two contestants or the principal contest, Lula and...
Yeah, there is two principal. There is, I think, 9 candidates. There is 4 that are spoken to. Those 2 are women. But the only 2 with real chances are Bolsonaro and Lula. And the environment is very violent. There has been a lot of political violence. Since you guys might know that Bolsonaro does encourage and did relax the gun laws in Brazil. So a lot of his supporters are gun-loving people, and the consequences is that there has been a lot more political assassination or murders motivated by political differences.
Bolsonaro is right-wing, supported by the Christian fundamentalist, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, he's
and like Trump.
Right-wing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's like a warped version of Trump.
Okay.
Similar in some things, worse than others.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's a chance. There's a chance for change, for real change.
Well, the chance of the hope of change, it is almost the certainty that Lula is going to be the next president, and people longs for the experiences that they had during his presidency, his 2 presidencies. So the life of the average Brazilian did change exponentially under the presidency of Lula and in minor degree of Dilma. But so people are very hopeful that better times are coming, because as I say to you, for example, yesterday or the day before, another case of domestic slavery was uncovered. People are going through hunger. People are, eating bones or using bones from the butchers to make soup and scrap. So there is a tangible deterioration of the quality of life under Bolsonaro, as well. The apprehension as far as physical violence for motives of dissenting political views.
Let me ask a quick question. We've got about 2 minutes left. How do Afro-Brazilians look at the question of the transfer of British royalty, even though Portugal and Spain have more context for Brazil? But the question of royalty itself, how does that affect us in the diaspora from your point of view?
It's funny. It's funny because actually the Queen of England came here to Bahia, and I saw her on the parade when I was 6 or 7, and I was in certain way shocked by those expressions of consternation that she died, and people expressing how sad and how so emotional, like, and even people in the world of capoeira, it's like, because she was here in Bahia, and there is became famous now, a picture of her, somebody playing the berimbau to her. But and this guy saying, oh, because she reminds me of, she has this grandmotherly air, it reminds me of my grandmother. I have to tell him, I'm sorry, my grandmother looked a lot different from her.
We have to leave it right there too. Joji, thank you, brother. Thank you, my friend. Kenneth,
You're welcome.
Thank you as well. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me out.